I want to help our audience understand nihilism in another way. Another word you use to describe life and life's core commitments is erotic. What does it mean to view life as being fundamentally erotic?
Yeah. Well, this goes back to the right kind of way of reading Nietzsche. Nietzsche wants, as he says from the very beginning of his career, to do philosophy from the perspective of life. And that means, what do we need to know in order to live well? It's a very, very Socratic question. And the way he puts that is by asking us whether the forms of knowledge that we seek, what we seek to become committed to or passionate to, can be einverleibt, incorporated, embodied from the perspective of life. That is something like a gamble. I mean, you've taken a gamble. You've left your tech company and you have no idea whether this will turn out to be satisfying or not. But this embodies a kind of perspective of life approach. Nietzsche didn't want to do traditional philosophy, didn't want to have traditional positions. He wanted a revolutionary new approach to how to think about ways of living, experiments in living, like you're undertaking yourself.
What I'm hearing in your answer is that for life to be erotic, or for life's commitments to be erotic, it's from a first person and not third person perspective.
Exactly.
When I'm erotically attracted to someone, it's not because of, I don't know, listing a series of attributes about the person that makes me attracted to them. It's the felt phenomenological experience of that. And I had a friend here who was dating a girl who really ticked all of his boxes, but for some reason, he didn't have that sort of passionate desire. And he kept asking, can I work the machine? It's in reference to Pascal.
Yeah.
If you know that the Christian God is the right one, can you work the machine? Can you habituate yourself into a sort of faith?
Yeah.
And despite all of his attempts, he couldn't work the machine. And so that's one of the things that we mean. And so when we say that life is erotic, or life's core commitments are erotic, are we also saying that they're not grounded on reason in any strong sense?
Yeah, I mean, lots of people know that things matter to them that they're embarrassed about. They would prefer that they don't matter, and they could actually take steps not to realize what actually happens to matter to them. Or they think there are things that should matter to them, like your friend, or like somebody who thinks that opera ought to matter to them. And so they go to the opera and they read the librettos and they read the history of opera because they want to be acculturated. But at the end of the day, they go to the opera, but it doesn't matter to them. The hidden sources of the things that really matter to us are actually instinctual and circumvent consciousness, reason, rationality, reflection, endorsement.
So this theory of life's commitments as erotic, on one hand, it's contrasted against a sort of Aristotelian habituation, right? The idea that if you just keep doing something, you're going to gain a sort of erotic desire to it. But it's also against a, Platonic, Kantian, reason-based form of grounding of commitments, right? That we can reason to these first principles, and that's what justifies our commitments. So what is at the ground of life's commitments for Nietzsche?
Well, I don't think Nietzsche thinks the idea of giving an answer to that question in kind of propositional terms is an adequate one. We have to look for examples in the past that are inspiring kind of exemplars of civilizational projects. People like Pericles, or Thucydides, or Aeschylus, or Sophocles, or the great epic poets. Nietzsche was trained as a classicist, and so that led him to a more kind of aesthetic view of life. This is a great difficulty of teaching Nietzsche. Students all want to know at the end of the course, well, what should we do? I mean, if it's all collapsed, then we can't rely on the traditional reflective models of endorsement. What are we left with? And I think Nietzsche is trying to present the situation as exactly the one we have to accept. And the things that emerge as kind of virtues for him are things like courage, honesty, straightforwardness, authenticity. Those are not things that can be given a kind of programmatic way.
I wanted to double click on what you said about finding exemplars in the past. And let me begin by reading a quote from your book. Since nihilism amounts to this erotic failure, not ignorance or delusion, addressing it properly becomes quite difficult because, as noted, one cannot be convinced that one ought to have a desire. That desire ought not to fail and thereby acquire it or sustain it. The most one might be able to do is offer oneself as an example of such an escape. As a Girardian, when I think about desire and what is at the core of desire, is imitation, right? Girard has this idea of mimetic desire, that we imitate those whom we consider to have a greater degree of being, and that's where the real root of desire is. Is Nietzsche perhaps saying something similar when he talks about offering oneself as an example, or what you were just saying about rescuing the Pericles of the world back as these cultural models? Is that, instead of the habituation or reason, a potential third ground for how we might inspire eroticism?
Well, certainly not habituation, because Nietzsche considers habituation a kind of deadening of the spirit, a kind of a way of going to sleep, a way of narcoticizing ourselves. And as we've been discussing, he doesn't think that our confidence that relying on rational self-reflection will actually get us very far. It fragments into contrasting camps. Girard's a very interesting example here, because as you know, Girard's narrative was that once we had sort of the divine, God, as a kind of model of imitative desire, and then we had the aristocrats, and then when aristocratic culture collapsed, we became much more interested in what other people were doing, and desire became imitative in a kind of democratized bourgeois way. But at the same time, we also realized that they weren't worthy of imitation, and a certain form of self-hatred occurred. That's, in a way, very similar to what Nietzsche calls the sort of collapse of society into a herd animal. When one settles on something that is inspiring, and one strives to realize that one has a kind of erotic commitment to a projected way of life, is willing to accept the risks we were talking about before, the gamble, it inevitably conflicts with what others have set themselves on a path to achieve.
It's agonistic.
Agonistic. And the question Nietzsche wants to raise is, how much conflict are we willing to tolerate in order not to collapse into a reduction of ambition for the sake of security and peaceableness? He thinks we're much too willing to compromise, to avoid conflictual situations. And this gets to, in a way, the kind of limitations of Nietzsche for a modern democratic or post-democratic society. Nietzsche is an elitist. He believes that the kinds of things we're talking about are available, if they're available, only for a small percentage of the population.